All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Early Migrations into and Out of New England. My name is Kathleen McKenzie, Education and Programming Manager here at American Ancestors, and I will be your moderator for today's session. This program is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history, and we're pleased to offer such programming to our members and friends around the world. Our presenter today is Chief Genealogist David Allen Lambert. David has been on the staff of American Ancestors since 1993, and he is an internationally recognized speaker on the topics of history and genealogy. He has published many articles in the New England Historical and Genealogical Register, the New Hampshire Genealogical Record, Rhode Island Roots, the Mayflower Descendant, and American Ancestors magazine. He has also published a guide to Massachusetts cemeteries. David is an elected fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston, Mass., and he is a life member of the New Hampshire Society of the Cincinnati. He's also the tribal genealogist for the Massachusetts Punkapog Indians of Massachusetts. His genealogical expertise includes New England and Atlantic Canadian records of the 17th through 21st century, military records, DNA research, and Native American and African American genealogical research in New England. Now, New England has long been a common stop and destination along popular migration routes throughout history. As a result, many of us with early roots in the United States have New England ancestors. In this online lecture today, David will discuss common 17th through 19th century migration patterns into and out of the region, key record sets for tracing these migrations, and more. At any point during today's presentation, please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A panel found at the bottom of your screen. We'll address as many as we can at the end. There's also an optional syllabus available for purchase if you're interested, and your purchase helps support us in making these free webinars. This presentation is also being recorded for later viewing on our website and our YouTube channel. So if you missed something on today's first listen, don't worry, you can always go back and review the presentation later. All right, so without further ado, please welcome David.
Thank you, Kathleen. Well, I'm delighted to bring this lecture to you today because there are so many people around the globe that have connections to New England. And perhaps your ancestors still live in New England and you really haven't gone very far. Some of my ancestors have moved only 1 or 2 towns in 350 plus years, whereas other ones went out further west to Wisconsin and even further. So I am delighted to talk about the migration patterns from the 17th century through the 19th century, as Kathleen has mentioned, and give you a little history along the way. Some general considerations to put forward. Migrations and settlement patterns within New England are rather complex. And the rhyme or reason why our ancestors show up someplace on a tax list, or they disappear from someplace, and then when you do a global search and you find them on a census in another state, but you don't have a diary or a direct relative that you could talk to why they may have migrated or even returned. Migration was not always from east or west, but from the coast into the interior. In fact, each colony had its own character based on the reasons of its original settlement. Let's talk about the settlement of early New England. Through the efforts of my longtime colleague, the scholar Robert Charles Anderson, has spent nearly 30 plus years now working on the Great Migration Study Project, and successive scholars are still working on this work today. And this includes those that arrived into the New England colonies between 1620 and 1640. The early migration from the time of the Mayflower through some of the early migrations to the New England Company or the Mass Bay Colony, into the Mass Bay Colony, does not start to peak until about 1628-29. And then by 1630, we have the Winthrop fleet coming in. and then it drops back down again. But then at the height of the Great Migration, starting around 1633 to the 1639, 1640 era, we find a large arrival, nearly 2,500 immigrants per year approximately. One of the greatest books, I believe, that talks about the expansion of New England was done by Lois Kimball Matthews. Her book, The Expansion of New England, The Spread of New England Settlement and Institutions to the Mississippi River, 1620 to 1865, is a reprint by American ancestors, but it is truly a good piece of reference to have on your shelf. On the right-hand side is a map of the New England settlement as it was 1637, just before the Pequot War. And as you can see, it's truly a coastal settlement. You see some settlements up as far as Portland, Maine, around Dover and Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Essex County, where Salem and Boston coming into Plymouth Colony. And then you look along the Connecticut River, you start to see settlements such as Springfield, Windsor, Hartford, and Wethersfield. And then into the Bay of Rhode Island, Cumberland, and Providence. And even further down, heading towards Long Island on the Connecticut, Saybrook, Connecticut. These are some of the places that your ancestors probably lived or nearabouts. Now, the early migration trails followed a variety of ways. They went by harbors, they went by water routes. So anything that you could get to coastally was going to be a lot more accessible than going inland, where there would not be any roads, and you had to cross rivers and mountain paths many times. And sometimes you were cutting virgin territory as the first European to come across this land. There were post roads from Boston to New York City and then on to Albany. And then, of course, we have early migration through daughter towns, the second generation, where they would expand to the borders. Proprietor records are a wonderful thing to look at for your ancestors, where these records will shed light onto the early settlement of communities. You might often find people that came from one town resettled into another. That could be for a variety of reasons or opportunity, and sometimes it's following their minister. It could be a religious move. Migration and settlement in New England, this map here from 1675, clearly shows the expanse in nearly 40 years after the 1630s, where you're getting more and more settlement all throughout the area of Rhode Island, even further into Middlesex County, out into the area which is now Worcester County, Massachusetts, and further down the Cape into other parts of Rhode Island. The biggest population, of course, at this time is in Massachusetts and in Connecticut. And the settlement from south to north also occurred, where you have individuals moving into the timberlands of New Hampshire or for seeking fishing grounds. And then, of course, you have the settlement of Long Island itself. Now, the 8 original colonies, Maine, originally called Ligonia, New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth Colony, Providence Plantations, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and the colony of New Haven, which would then, of course, become part of Connecticut, as would Plymouth Colony would become part of Massachusetts Bay Colony. Plymouth Colony was established in 1620 by the Pilgrims, and many individuals, in fact, 35 million descendants of the original survivors of the first winter, dot the landscape across the globe. It encompasses what is now southeastern Massachusetts, Cape Cod, and the islands, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket. The core group were separatists who had first fled from Leiden, Holland, and a small population that grew very slowly. Friendly relationships did exist between John Winthrop's Massachusetts Bay Colony, and the company had many mergers within it, within land transactions. And you do find people from Plymouth Colony settling in Boston, even though the ideology of the Puritans in Mass Bay Colony was far more strict than the Pilgrims in Plymouth Colony. You find by 1691 this merger occurs where the colony becomes the two colonies become one. Now we also see many people from Plymouth Colony emigrating not just within Massachusetts, but off to places such as Dutchess County, New York, Cape May, New Jersey, and along coastal Maine. The Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1620 had various scattered settlements in Cape Ann. That's where you see that on the timeline where it's very, very limited. You like to see that the Plymouth colony, but there are dotted colony settlements along the coast in Massachusetts, again up in Essex County around Cape Ann. By 1628, the John Endicott settles a group in Salem, Massachusetts. Now, by 1630, the Mass Bay Company comes in with Winthrop's fleet into Boston. Endicott's was the New England Company. The established and led by Puritan doctrine, religion, and government. Their ideology was completely different than the Pilgrims in Plymouth Colony. In fact, more strict on many levels. By far the most populous and influential colony in New England. The dissidents soon founded New Hampshire, Providence, Connecticut, and New Haven colonies, primarily because of the strict doctrines of the Puritans. Providence, Rhode Island colonies. Roger Williams, a Baptist, settled Narragansett Bay in Providence, what is now Providence, Rhode Island, in 1638, following along the old Bay Road, which still exists today, going from Boston into Rhode Island. William Coddington received a separate charter for Newport and Portsmouth by 1651. The various colonies of Narragansett Bay, Providence, and Newport and Portsmouth reconciled and came together as one by 1660. They had great toleration for other sects. In fact, the earliest settlement of Jewish in Truro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, is there. You have, of course, the Baptists, the Quakers, and you had a lot of acceptance and religious tolerance for the native population. There was a lot of Christianization of native populations by Roger Williams, who settled and preached to the Narragansett Indians. The migration for Connecticut and Western Mass, Vermont, and central New York took place by those early settlers' descendants from Providence and Rhode Island colonies. Connecticut. Reverend Hooker led a group from Cambridge, Massachusetts overland to what is now Hartford, Connecticut in 1636. Hooker's group believed that the church membership requirements were too strict. Basically, again, the Puritan doctrine was not for them, and they felt like they needed to go on and learn and live in a different ideology. Windsor settlement settled in from Dorchester, Massachusetts, again in the Mass Bay Colony, just south of Boston. Wethersfield went by water from Boston, so the people who settled in Wethersfield, Connecticut, traveled by water from Boston. Springfield, Massachusetts was settled from Roxbury, Massachusetts settlers for the most part. And Windham and Litchfield counties were the last areas to be settled in what would be the Connecticut colony. Again, there were two colonies originally in what is now Connecticut. The New Haven colony was polar opposite than the Connecticut colony. New Haven was settled by Davenport and Eaton. Thought that Winthrop and Company were not strict enough. That's right. So you have one group with Reverend Hooker leaving and forming Connecticut colony because it was too strict. And Davenport and Eaton thought that Winthrop and Company were a little too lenient. So they settled and created the New Haven colony. The core group were wealthy London merchants. The town of Saybrook was settled in 1635-36 by, incidentally, John Winthrop Jr., the son of the very man that Davenport and Eaton felt was not up to their standards, and also Lyon Gardner. Guilford, Connecticut was settled in 1639 by Reverend Henry Whitfield from Kent and Surrey, England. Milford in 1639 came from settlers from Essex and York, England. Stratford was settled in 1639 with settlers from Concord, Massachusetts, Boston, Roxbury, Massachusetts, and also those from Wethersfield. Northern New England. At first, it was very limited, primarily because of the remote location of roads in the mountainous and the poor farming. Our best crop in New England, unfortunately, is rocks, thanks to the glaciers. Also, northern New England did not have the fortification that a coastal community would have or on a riverway. It was also very vulnerable to attack through the end of the French and Indian War. There were very few east to west roads in northern New England as well. So primarily you were in virgin territory for any way of getting from one place to the next by horseback. Most later settlements from Massachusetts or up the Connecticut Valley were primarily the way northern New England would be settled. And again, it's a little later. I'm almost getting into the time frame of the French and Indian War and shortly after. Maine acted as, quote, a safety valve, siphoning off migrants who would have gone west because Maine frontier was a little way of going coastally up northern New England, but not so far as going inland. New Hampshire. In 1623, the communities of Dover and Portsmouth were settled. Now, from New Hampshire was primarily had settlement from people from the West Country, mostly fishermen and merchants seeking opportunity. New Hampshire wasn't very religious at that point in time. So again, you could think of it like Connecticut colony not being as strict as Mass Bay colony. In 1638, Exeter, New Hampshire was settled by Reverend John Wheelwright. In 1638, the Reverend Stephen Batchelder and Dalton settled what is now Hampton, New Hampshire. In fact, even for a part of the history of southern New Hampshire, there's a bit of an overlap into Massachusetts, where you have Old Norfolk County, established in 1643 by Massachusetts Bay, the northern part of Old Norfolk being parts of what are now, say, Salisbury, New Hampshire. And the ironic thing about calling it Old Norfolk, it wasn't, of course, called Old Norfolk in the 17th century. It was just called Norfolk County. When Old Norfolk ceased to exist in the early part of the 18th century, the name Norfolk County was resurrected again in 1793 and formed the southern half of what it was originally Suffolk County. So Norfolk County is a new Norfolk now, and there's the old Norfolk. New Hampshire towns united as a colony together in 1679, and there was little settlement in the interior. Again, the east to west roads, mountainous regions. No one was going to go build a community on the top of the White Mountains. And it was one of those things where as the 1700s and the 1800s progress, more settlement would go further in. And there are still parts of New Hampshire now which are very, very wooded and not very densely settled. Just look some of the maps here to show the most of the 18th century growth came in from Massachusetts migration. And also there were town grants that were given by Governor Benning Wentworth, which you find these grants in the New Hampshire State Papers. This is a published series that you can find on archive.org. And this is a great way of finding out about these early grants settling it. So if we begin on the upper left-hand corner, you can see the settlement is around Portsmouth in other areas by 1650. By 1700, 50 years later, really not a lot of change. And even by 1725, but by 1750, further expansion is going up into the rivers. By 1775, the population has exploded. And by 1800, the entire state has the dotted population. A lot of people travel up the Connecticut River Valley from Western Massachusetts and Connecticut to settle this area. Ideally, think of it this way. Your ancestor had a family with 10 children. The oldest son, by primogeniture, will no doubt inherit the farm. What about the 8th son? Well, the opportunity may have been to stay in the same community, or you may have found of opportunity and available land in New Hampshire and elsewhere. That is probably one of the reasons to migrate. Maine. It had scattered settlements early on in the 1620s and earlier along the coast of Cape Elizabeth to Pemaquid. Now, under the jurisdiction of Massachusetts, Maine remained until the Missouri Compromise of 1820, where Maine became a free state and Missouri became an enslaver state. It was abandoned briefly in 1675. The King Philip's War, which I could speak on for an entire hour, really disrupted the settlement of New England, whereas King Philip Metacomet pushed into the raiding parties onto various places in Massachusetts and even into Maine. And some of these settlements were completely abandoned. And this is the same case with Maine. You're in an area that's not heavily protected, and raiding parties could get in and destroy it. And it wasn't always just the King Philip's War, even into the 1690s with the French and some of the Indians coming down from Canada, you find this being an issue as well, both Maine and New Hampshire. There's little new settlement until really after the Revolutionary War. And there's a large post-Revolutionary War influx, again, into Maine from places such as Eastern Massachusetts, again, seeking opportunity in Cape Cod. Again, Cape Cod being primarily mariners and merchants are seeking that same opportunity in what is now Maine. Now, much of central Maine was not settled until the early 1800s, and even for this part now, northern Maine and some parts of central Maine are still very sparsely settled. Again, Maine remained that safety valve for eastern New England migrants until the middle 1800s, when opportunities such as gold in California, in open land and land rushes became another opportunity for them to take. Just in comparison, I was talking about King Philip's War again, so I thought this slide would be important. This is a more closer view of that settlement of New England in 1637. And in 1675, just before King Philip's War, you can see where the expansion had gone out and pretty much almost tripled. We're going to move to the next slide here. And as you can see, the settlement pushes back in 1677, just after the King Philip's War, where settlements became more easterly and further closer to the Connecticut River, where they could be protected. And again, it then started to re-emerge with further settlement. And in less than 40 years later, as the map on the right exhibits, Massachusetts just explodes. So does Connecticut in areas for heading further up the coast along New Hampshire and Maine. Second generation towns. Second generation towns are usually founded for more economic rather than religious reasons. Now, for instance, Concord, Massachusetts was settled as the first non-contiguous town for that matter. Other towns had followed, places your ancestors may have settled: Northampton, Groton, and Lancaster, Marlborough and Framingham. Mendon, Massachusetts was founded in 1660 primarily from people seeking opportunity from the towns of Braintree and Weymouth. It's very important to understand the town history and the settlement of these second generation towns to know where their parents and grandparents may have lived early on in New England. And sometimes town histories give you that insight, but it could be something as easily as finding a name on a tax list in a previous community and noticing that there's sort of a structured group that appear in both communities. It's almost a forensic analysis, if you will, of a town's history back to where it came from. And usually town histories will give you some good insight as to where the early settlers came in from. And you can also do that by looking at deeds. Deeds, oftentimes when people are purchasing land or even through proprietorship, may anchor where they came from before they were settling in that area, because they may have invested in the land before they were permanently settled. Other communities, our second generation towns, include Northfield, and that was settled from people from Northampton, Hadley, and Hatfield. Worcester and Brookfield, Massachusetts was settled in an attempt to link the coast with the Connecticut Valley. Here's a great breakdown of when the towns were originally settled, and it kind of gives you a color scale of where 1620 to 39 is that really dark orange. Yellow is 1640 to 1665, and again, you can almost watch it balloon out. 1666 to 1691 is a little lighter orange. And then sort of a peach color, 1692 to 1715, you start to see towns that daughter out. And sometimes the daughtering out of a town doesn't mean that it wasn't even settled to begin with. It could have been separated. A division of the boundaries of the town were set up because they created a new church, or there was such a population expanse that it really negated having a new community. So you find that in a lot of places. Towns like Dorchester separated to found, for instance, in 1726, the town of Stoughton. Now, 1726, Stoughton encompassed now what is the towns of Avon, Canton, parts of Foxborough, and Sharon. So as you can see, they divided out and divided out. And then we can see the furthest expanse is places that were settled, such as the town of Irving in 1815. But this is a really nice way of looking at the division. Rhode Island, anxious to establish a western boundary with Connecticut, so their expansion for secondary towns went out, so they pushed further west. Woonsocket was settled in 1666. Barrington was 1667. It was part of Swansea, technically, until 1717. Westerly, Charleston, Hopkinton, and Richmond were settled by 1669. And many people from Rhode Island would later immigrate to Vermont and central New York. Connecticut, a secondary town would come out with Enfield in 1681, including Danbury, Mansfield, and Windham by 1687. Woodstock was settled in 1686 from people from Roxbury, Massachusetts. Lebanon was settled in the 1690s from New London, Plymouth, and Northampton. Litchfield County opened to public auction in the 1720s, mostly from settlers from Fairfield County, Connecticut. And of course, movement north into Sheffield and Stockbridge, Massachusetts, again for opportunity. Long Island, genealogically, it really is an extension of New England. Gravesend was settled in 1640 with people from Massachusetts Bay Colony. Southampton, Long Island, was settled from families from Lynn, Massachusetts, in Essex County. Then later towns include New England connections with Southold, East Hampton, Hempstead, Jamaica. Western end of the island was mainly Dutch and was really kind of completely set off until about 1670. And Long Island became a jumping off point for later migration to places such as Westchester County, New York, closer to what is now New York City, and the other colony of New Jersey. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. This ended years of disruption between the French and Indians. The area of New England settlement had been really static, as I had mentioned, since the time of the King Philip's War, really not really increasing. And we saw one of those earlier maps where we go from about 1677 to 1713, and the population just seems to explode within that 40-year time frame. Dozens of new towns were established over these 40-year period, mostly in southern New England. And again, that land speculation and putting out grants by Governor Ben Wentworth from New Hampshire was part of that. It expanded further into New Hampshire. The Ulster Scot population had come in after 1718. Now, they were responsible for settlement of places such as Lunenburg, Massachusetts, Palmer, Coleraine, Hopkinton, Blandford, Pelham, and even Worcester, Massachusetts. So you might find that you have ancestors from there that may have Scottish surnames. Have you ever traced it back? Are they Ulster Scot? Derry, Londonderry, Bedford, Merrimack, Antrim, and Peterborough, New Hampshire. Some of them, just for the name itself, Derry and Londonderry and Antrim, give a clue back to the Northern Irish connection of these Ulster Scots in the settlement, and again from the 1718 period, little in through the 18th century. Topsham, Belfast was settled partly from Londonderry, New Hampshire. Thomaston and Waldoboro, Maine, are also settlements of Ulster Scots. And in the case of Belfast, having settled originally in Londonderry and then moving into Belfast ultimately. Berkshire County, Massachusetts, the furthest west you can go before you hit New York and the borders of Connecticut and Vermont. Primarily, it was attracted New Englanders and also Dutch settlers into the area from where it had been previously in parts of the counties of New York. Now, New Marlborough from Canterbury, Suffield, Northampton, and Dedham. Alfred in Berkshire County was settled primarily from people in Connecticut. And Sandusfield and Enfield and Wethersfield was settled by people from Cape Cod. Lenox and West Hartford was settled by individuals from Wallingford. Sheffield was settled from people from Westfield and Connecticut. And Otis had proprietors that signed up for proprietorship land from Tyringham, and settlers from Enfield, Granfield, Suffield, Woodstock, and Hebron also settled in the area of what is now Otis. Williamstown was settled from people from Connecticut, Northampton, and Hatfield. And Pittsfield was settled from people who had settled in Wethersfield. Again, these second generation towns. Now, there's also Canadian grant towns. The 9 townships that are 6 miles square in a double row in 1727 were given to heirs of the 1690 failed Canadian expedition up to Canada, sometimes known as the Phips expedition. And this is where Dorchester and Newbury men and others would go to try to capture what is now Quebec and parts of what now also Acadia. So, for instance, people that were from Beverly, Massachusetts, that went to Canada got land grants in what is now where New Hampshire. People from Salem who went to Canada got land in what is now Leidenborough, New Hampshire. People from Sylvester who went to Canada, Rindge, New Hampshire. Rowley, Massachusetts got land in Royalston, Massachusetts. And people from Ipswich got land in Winchendon, Massachusetts. Now, there are also Narragansett townships, and this is granted in 1728 to heirs of the King Philip's War. So the town of Buxton, Maine was settled in 1748. Westminster, Massachusetts, originally Wachusett. Amherst, New Hampshire, the Sauhegan West, originally called, was number 3. Number 4 is Greenwich, Mass. Township number 5 is Bedford, New Hampshire. Township number 6 is Templeton, Mass. And 7 is Gorham, Maine, settled in 1736. Other towns also included Voluntown, Connecticut, that granted land to Connecticut veterans of the time of the King Philip's War. So we think of military service as something where pensions and land grants are something of the Revolution, War of 1812, or the Civil War. But this is true also for the 17th century war, where not the veteran per se, but their children and grandchildren may make application to get land based on their former dad or grandfather's service. Monadnock townships were also settled. We get Rindge, New Hampshire, Jaffrey, New Hampshire, Dublin, New Hampshire, Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire, Marlborough, New Hampshire, Nelson, which is Packersfield, New Hampshire, Stoddard, New Hampshire, and Washington, New Hampshire, all in the Cheshire Hills. These settlements are part of that sort of land grants for the Monadnock townships. New Hampshire towns were granted by Massachusetts. And so because of the part where New England was the Dominion of New England, you have this connection on a lot of cases with Maine and New Hampshire land and Massachusetts having authority to grant it. So Boscawen, New Hampshire was granted as Honontook in 1732. Charlestown, which is township number 4, was granted in 1735. Hence Concord, originally parts of what Pennacook and Rumford was granted in 1659. Dumbarton was granted in 1735. Hampton was granted in 1635 as Winnicott and settled by 1638. Keene, New Hampshire was granted in 1733 and known as Upper Ashuelot. Leidenborough was granted in 1735 as Salem, Canada. for the service of those that had served in the Phipps expedition and the expedition in Canada in 1690. Manchester was granted in 1735 and Pembroke, New Hampshire granted in 1728. New Hampshire towns also settled by Massachusetts. We have Bradford, which was settled by individuals from Bradford, Massachusetts in Essex County. It is very common to find towns in New Hampshire and Maine and Vermont that are renamed for the community where a large majority of the first settlers came from. Brookline, Hollis, Nashua, and Pelham were part of the old Dunstable grant of land. So the Dunstable split and created these towns. Croydon and Grafton, Croydon came from Grafton and Sutton, Massachusetts. Dalton was settled in the 1760s from Newburyport and named for the primary proprietor, Sir Timothy Dalton. Hinsdale was part of Northfield, Massachusetts settlement, and Plastow was originally part of Haverhill, Massachusetts. Maine, in 1677, the General Court had authorized resettlement, but no one tended to resettle there because without a license to do so. Again, we're still dealing with a very insecure frontier, and we just got over the King Philip's War. There was a very small population until the middle part of the 1700s, and actually really almost no growth at all, again, to central and northern Maine. By 1720, there was no settlement north of Berwick, Maine, or east of Georgetown. Settlement was hampered by fear of attack of the French and Indians and disputes over overlapping land grants. So think about this. You got a land grant, and then you find out that somebody has already cleared the trees or planted their crops, but it's on your property. There was a lot of things brought to the courts in Old York, Maine. York was the original name for all of the counties in Maine through 1760. And only 400 people lived in Portland, Maine, which is in southeastern Maine, in 1726. So again, not a lot of settlement. Vermont had really little settlement before 1761. My colleague Scott Andrew Bartley is doing an intense piece of scholarship on the early settlements county by county in Vermont. And you might want to take a look at our bookstore to see if he's covered the county you're looking for. Conflicting claims and grants by New Hampshire and New York tore Vermont back and forth because New Hampshire claimed the eastern border, New York claimed the western border, and sort of tore between. In fact, this contention went on for quite a while. In fact, through most of the 18th century. Fort Dummer was a settlement in Vermont, again, being a fortress and fortified, and you would have the community grew up around it by 1724. Vernon had settlement in the 1740s, again, from people from Western Mass, Northampton, Massachusetts, and Northfield, Massachusetts. Putney was settled around 1755, and by 1776, again, it took about almost 2 decades, there are now 74 new towns established in Vermont. Vermont, well, so Rhode Islanders mainly from Smithfield area to Marlborough and Bennington and Shaftesbury, Danbury, and Londonderry are going to be settling in the Smithfield area. So you're finding that this expansion of Rhode Islanders from Smithfield are going in to Vermont. But again, the towns of Marlborough, Bennington, Shaftesbury, Danbury, and Londonderry being primarily where they're from. Norwich and Preston Norwich came from the settlers of Preston and Mansfield, Connecticut. Arlington was settled in 1764 by Newtown Episcopalians. So finally, a little bit of a religious push at that point in time. And Hartford was settled from people from Lebanon, Connecticut. Most of the settlers from Vermont primarily, again, come from Connecticut and Western Massachusetts, and you'll find a lot of duplication of the town names into Vermont, again, from pre-settled communities in Massachusetts and Connecticut. The settlements from the south to the north really began along the riverways for obvious reasons. And best land was filled up first, so the best planting areas, the rich valleys along the rivers. Here's that example of New England. Now we've gone forward to 1754, and we truly are not northern New England, but the northern coastal parts of New England and southeastern New England is almost pushed completely tight with settlement. The Cape Cod and the islands, we have Long Island, we have even expanse again, as you can see, up the riverways into Vermont by then, just starting. Migrations outside of New England. Well, that elbow room that your ancestors sought by the second and third generation, by the fourth generation of the immigrants that arrived in New England, they may have sought places elsewhere for a variety of reasons. Canada was one of the options that you could choose, and you might be surprised. So Canada was an area for pre-loyalist settlement, because a lot of people think, well, why did my ancestors live in Nova Scotia? They must have been loyalist. Well, if they arrived from 1755 to the 1760s in what is now Nova Scotia, that would have been New England planters. These are individuals who sought land that was available that came into the hands of the British Crown after the French and Indian Wars. They expulsed the Acadians out of Atlantic Canada in places such as Ile Saint Jean, which is Prince Edward Island, Acadia, Nova Scotia, and of course part of Nova Scotia is New Brunswick. So you see Nova Scotia and New Brunswick being settled by these New England planters. They also later were joined by Ulster and Yorkshire immigrants within a decade later. Now, of course, Canadian loyalists a decade or so later are those loyal to the crown. And this, of course, is often land was confiscated and may be settled upon later. So there were crown land grants given for the memorials for loyalists to the king that may have come from Massachusetts or elsewhere in the colonies. And they mentioned their losses, and they would be granted land, if you will. Not every arrival from the United States and Canada after 1783 was a loyalist. My own ancestor went up to Canada in 1791 and would later fight in the War of 1812, and his father fought in the Revolution. He was far from being a loyalist, but he was seeking opportunity in St. Stephen's, New Brunswick. I was very surprised to see him up there in the 1790s, but it makes sense what he did for work. He was a merchant. New England settlement of New York. So the area of Gravesend in 1640 settled people from Massachusetts. Southampton, Long Island, 1656 was settled primarily from 40 families from Lynn, Massachusetts. The migration of New York is migration from Connecticut into Long Island. It makes sense. So you just go right down the coast in the Long Island Sound or across the Long Island Sound into Connecticut. Bedford and Rye, New York, were settled from people from Connecticut, Rhode Island, and southeastern Massachusetts. The oblong of New York was mainly settled by Cape Cod Quakers, and the Beekman, Patton, and Dutchess County were also settled by New Englanders. New York military tracts, and these are to compensate New York's Revolutionary War soldiers. So not a federal bounty land, if you will, but one assigned by the state of New York. Nearly 2 million acres of Cayuga, Cortland, Onondaga, Seneca counties, and parts of Oswego, Tompkins, Schuyler, and Wayne County were set aside to compensate Revolutionary War soldiers. Remember, we were land rich after the Revolutionary War, but cash poor for the Continental government. New York land purchase. This map kind of shows you some of the various purchases between 1786 and 1793. In the areas that they are, the Phelps-Gorham purchase, for instance, in 1788, the Holland purchase in 1792, the Pulteney purchase in 91, and the military tracts just to the right of them. And these are basically areas that you may find your ancestors settling right after the Revolutionary War. So not necessarily from Revolutionary War service and getting tracts because they didn't serve for the colony of New York, but because there was land opening up and land to purchase. Looking at a dotted map, we can kind of see the range of where the frontier of New York is settled by. So this represents where the settlement of New York by Connecticut natives appears. The next is by Massachusetts, equally about the same. Connecticut and Massachusetts moving into those areas of land purchases that were available. And then post-Revolutionary War, New Hampshire, just a little bit. If you notice, it's in the parts that are contested up by the Vermont border on the upper right-hand part of your screen into the map of northeastern New York. Vermont, well, they're pushing out everywhere. And this again is post-Revolutionary War frontier. They're already at the border and they push even inward. And you can almost see the expansive migration along the coast. Rhode Island natives, sporadic. It's just sort of in central New York by the time of the post-Revolutionary War frontier. New Jersey. Newark, New Jersey in 1661 was settled by a lot of individuals that came from New Haven, Connecticut. So if you've often wondered what happened to the siblings of some of your Connecticut ancestors, look no further than the colony of New Jersey. Woodbridge was settled in 1661. Piscataway, Elizabeth, Cape May, and Salem County was actually settled by Quakers from New England. So all of these have a New England connection, these communities. Pennsylvania, Quakers that went to the Delaware Valley in the 1680s often would come from New England and Rhode Island and whatnot. So you have the Quaker settlements that open up because other Quakers are coming into Pennsylvania. It's a light colony. Susquehanna County was organized in 1753 by individuals from Connecticut. Wyoming Valley settled chiefly from Windham, Tolland, New London counties in Rhode Island. Bingham heirs hand land across the northern Pennsylvania boundary. And in fact, if you look at the Western Reserve, if you will, going across that blue strip is the secessions of Western lands from 1776 to 1802 of both Connecticut and South Carolina. The colonial roads were also a factor. As we were talking earlier, there were not a lot of in northern New England roads to go through mountains. As the other colonies built their roads, postal roads, military roads, you had the availability of getting. Now, the King's Highway and the post roads from Boston to New York and to Albany, but then they would expand from those points further. New York would go on to Philadelphia, and Philadelphia would go into the Carolinas. And these maps show the roads that your ancestors may have taken to get to where they traveled, or they could have gone coastally if they had the means. Ohio Company was settled in 1787 in Marietta, again with strong push of New Englanders. The Western Reserve, keeping in mind, was a Connecticut land company. As you see, that swath of land went straight across into what is now Cleveland, Ohio. You may want to visit some point the Western Reserve Historical Society. Lots of records on New England. If you're even in Ohio, you'd be surprised. U.S. military district settlements, again, for land to compensate soldiers from the Revolution. There's a refugee track for those that had land burnt out during the war, or lost land. And there's also further migration into the Northwest Territory. Some of you may have ancestors that started off in Ohio, then went further on down the Mississippi into places like New Orleans or elsewhere. The distribution patterns, we can look at these maps just for these 6 families, the Chaffees, Conneys, Coneys, Farwell, Greeley, Willman, and Whites. In 1671, we can see where they are in Essex County and some down towards the Rhode Island border. By 1721, it's expanded a little bit, but by 1771, we can see that they're going up all of the riverways, even into parts of Connecticut and northern Maine. Now, where did these same families go in New York? As you could see, because of where they settled a generation or so before, they're starting in Massachusetts, they went into Rhode Island, in Connecticut, and Vermont. And of course, then those settlements echo where the families are appearing in the 1790s and later. The South. Dorchester, South Carolina. You've heard me mention Dorchester, south of Boston, a few times. that was settled by individuals from Dorchester, Massachusetts. 1760, Waldoboro, Maine Germans, the Moravians, settled what is now Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Again, we're seeing religious movements at this point in time. In the 1770, Quakers from the island of Nantucket go to Guilford and Onslow counties, North Carolina. And then you also see a lot of settlement into other southern cities, merchants, people seeking opportunities, farmers that would see the planting areas of the South for plantations. So you have New Englanders then fighting in the Civil War with their distant cousins with the same surname that had plantations and were fighting for the Confederacy over farmers living in the South where their own cousins were from New England. 19th century migrations for religion. The migration of the Mormons from Western New York in the 1820s to Kirtland, Ohio a decade later, into Missouri by 1838, by Nauvoo, Illinois in 1840, and ultimately into Salt Lake City, into Utah in 1847, just shows one migration pattern. And the research that has been done by Family Search to document the members of the Mormon pioneers that had gone out west and then down into Utah is amazing. So if you have connections to this, I'm sure that you've already know the handcart path or the route your ancestor may have come. In fact, some of your ancestors that may have joined the Mormon Church may have actually come from England and came across as migrants into the East Coast and then followed to these settlements and then ultimately onto Utah. Key sources and repositories that I'd like to chat about. So how do you figure out what applies to your personal research? Well, I would personally begin with the Genealogist Handbook for New England, done by my colleague, Rhonda McClure. The 6th edition is a great way to understand the breakdown of New England for your ancestral connections. The organization of this handbook really holds on to a previous editions that we have. Again, we're in the 6th edition, provides significantly enhanced features. As shown on the left-hand page, each state section begins with a profile of the state, including maps and information about how to find the key records. On the right-hand side of the page, you can see that within the state section are county maps showing the townships within the county. The final section of the state is the stable town showing the town's county affiliation when the town was formed, and any parent or daughter towns, which becomes very valuable if you want to learn where your ancestors may have moved to, or you're seeking that cemetery in that community. Don't realize why you can't find it in the original town. It's because it's now in a daughtered town that's split off in the neighboring border. And it also gives special information such as the probate district to where the town belongs. This example of Windham County, Connecticut map shows you in the Connecticut chapter, the names of locations of towns within the county. Let's say we're looking for the town of Chaplin, which we're pointing to here. In the town table for Connecticut, we can then see the towns that are listed alphabetically, and Chaplin is at the top of the page, and we see that it is part of the Probate District 28. We see the town was incorporated in 1822, and it was formed from the towns of Hampton, Mansfield, and Windham, all coming together to form this town of Chaplin. Now, for family history researcher, this means that our ancestors settled Chaplin before its incorporation date, say around 1800. The records they seek may be in Hampton, Mansfield, or Windham, depending on the precise location of their family farm. We also see that the town is also known as Suffrage, that vital records exist in the Barber collection, and also AA, the American Ancestors Database. And we can find that also there are manuscripts at American Ancestors for this as well. Another option is you could use the Family Search Wiki. From the main page of the Family Search Wiki, you can search that within the next box, county by county, state by state, and find valuable links to go to resources as well. The Family Search Wiki has thousands of articles about locations and topics. On our very own American Ancestors .org, you can find a research guide town by town for all the 6 New England states. From the main page, select Tools, and at the top of the page from the drop-down, you can select the research guides. And as a research guide, scroll down to Town Guides. The research guides are alphabetical for within each town by the state. Now, this slide lists some key repositories of the region: the New England Historic Genealogical Society, American Ancestors, the General Society of Mayflower Descendants for all documents Mayflower related. For the Northeast region, we have the NARA, New England National Archives Records Administration branch, the Connecticut State Library for their church records, and perhaps most importantly, the historical societies for each state, and also historical societies within each town. When researching New England, make sure to contact and use resources of these outstanding historical societies. And we also welcome you to American Ancestors when we open very soon. Vermont History digital collections are another way of finding your resources, and you can find that on American Ancestors. The Connecticut State Library is another place that we can find a variety of resources. On their own website, you can find their collection guides and handbooks that will essentially help you step by step through Connecticut research. The online resources, again, are going to be able to help you find these locations. And again, right on the screen with some of these websites. And again, we do have an optional syllabus that you can purchase. Vermont History digital collections are a great way of finding great resources for Vermont at your fingertips. And this is one that you may use if you're looking for those ancestors that lived up in Vermont and may have also been in New York or New Hampshire. Remember that contested land. Where your ancestor settled from Vermont is part of your mystery. Maybe the Vermont History digital collections can be your aid. And then just review, the Great Migration into New England peaked 1633 to 1640. So that might be when the most of your earliest ancestors came in. They could have come in from 1620 to 33. They may have arrived after 1640. Early migration in the 17th century was often for religious reasons. And New Englanders settled Atlantic Canada after the French and Indian War as planters, and during the Revolution War as loyalists, just to know that there are 2 waves of migration. Land west of the Appalachians opened up for settlement after the Revolutionary War, where the borders were open and there were land tracts, as we saw for New York, military tracts, etc. And in the 19th century, we saw continued movement out of New England. This is the earliest of the settlements into the West, if you will, and more in depth into the 19th and the 20th century. And with New England, we see a shift in the 19th century from farms to urban cities, of course, due to the Industrial Revolution.
All right, thank you so much, David, for that excellent presentation today. We will get into the great questions that have been coming in, but first I quickly just wanted to highlight some upcoming events that we have. So first up here, tying in very closely with the topic of today's lecture, is an online seminar that will be taking place in October called the 17th Century Great Migration to New England and Beyond, Conventicles, Companies, Congregations, and Dispersal. And this will be presented by Robert Charles Anderson. He'll be presenting all 5 classes included in that course. So that's a great one. Definitely check that out. And then this month, we're currently in the midst of another online seminar, Expert Strategies for Breaking Down Brick Walls. It's not too late to sign up for that. We have 3 more classes ahead of us, and you would get the recordings to the first 2 if you signed up today. And then finally, we have an online lecture here, another free webinar that will be offered next month on October 17th on the basics of Mayflower research. You can learn more about these and other upcoming events at americanancestors.org/events. All right, so now we will dive into your questions. So first up, David, we got a few questions. You had mentioned proprietor records. Could you define what those records are?
Sure. Now, we look at our ancestors, we typically look for key records like vital records, probates, last will and testaments, or deeds. Oftentimes we find our ancestors living in a community, but we don't find the deed, Kathleen, when they buy the land, because some of the earliest communities in New England were not set up by counties selling land. It was by proprietors. A group of individuals were set aside with authority from the government to create a community. This proprietorship records, many of these are published or available on microfilm from familysearch.org digitally, or you can find them in the individual's towns. These proprietorship records are the earliest of the land records for the community, and you may find that your ancestor is ultimately selling land, and the back reference to where he acquired it is actually through proprietorship, and this is common in the 17th and 18th century in New England.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And then we also got several questions about those great maps that were included throughout the lecture. I believe they all came from the expansion of New England. Is that correct, David?
The
And if
majority
so,
of them did, yes. They're from Lois Matthews' book, which again is something available for sale from our bookshop because we sell it as one of our classic reprints.
okay, great. And just to repeat, so it's The Expansion of New England by Lois Matthews. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, perfect. And then we had a question in asking how physically did our New England ancestors leave New England, for example, in the early 1800s? Was it covered wagons, down rivers on flatboats? And this person mentions she had ancestors who moved from Massachusetts to Louisiana, and is
Oh,
very curious how they kind of made that journey, especially in a short amount of time.
sure. Well, there's a variety of ways, and what you had mentioned makes sense. I mean, if you're going out to Ohio and taking flatboats and then connecting to the Mississippi and going down the Mississippi, and of course stopping from place to place where there's settlements all the way down to New Orleans, that is an option. And it may have taken a bit of time, and they may have had partial migration to one place, stayed, wintered, and gone elsewhere. Yeah, there was another option. My third great grandfather had a brother-in-law who was a merchant, and he was out of Newburyport, and would go down to New Orleans all the time as part of travel. And I have merchant ships that would take passengers, and they would leave Boston, and they would come around Florida and go right up into the Gulf of Mexico into New Orleans. So by the 18 teens, you could easily have a vessel even before going into New Orleans. In fact, my great great grandfather's brother was down there after the War of 1812 and died there in the early 1820s. And he never went on by riverboat. They went all coastally by commercial ship.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
And then an interesting question here. Someone says they have relatives born in Westminster, Mass, and relatives showing up in Leominster and Fitchburg. And they ask, how can I find out if the town boundary changed, not, that they actually moved from one town to another? Any recommendations for that?
Well, one would be Rhonda's book that gives you the date of the incorporation of the town, and then it would give you the daughter towns out. The other thing would, of course, is on our online resources, we have the town guides, and that can give you a little of the basic information as well to figure out what town separated and formed another. These splitting off of towns can be very confusing, but once you have a handle on it, you might be now looking for church records in another community. And a lot of times these towns splintered off because there was a second church and they didn't want to attend the other. In my hometown of Stoughton, for instance, starting in 1726, we had one church. A split to the west parish became now what's now Sharon, Mass. A split to the southern parish, it was formed a third parish. And then these parishes eventually became towns.
All right, great. Thank you.
Mhm.
And then a question here. Someone says, at what point and why may New Englanders have ended up in the South or going southward? It seems that very few of my lines cross over the Mason-Dixon line even before the Civil War, but I occasionally find claims of Northerners in the South, though I tend to be skeptical. Any answer for that?
Well, our DNA has definitely showed that we have cousin connects out of New England down to the south. And of course, what I find mostly from mine is that there are opportunities for land, people that are merchants that are going into the cities, that you people go to Richmond or go to Charleston and places like that. And then, of course, there are people with agrarian interests, and they go down because you can get a larger plot of land. You're up in New Hampshire, the farming land isn't as good. You can go down to, say, Virginia or Georgia, and you can get thousands of acres, and the price might be something that fits into what you're hoping to do. Maybe you want to invest in tobacco, or you want to grow crops like cotton. And this is where the New Englanders saw the opportunity. And again, a generation or two or three later, and we find these same families fighting on the battlefields of the Civil War with the same last names and being cousins, and not that first cousin connect, but distant cousin connects, because back in the 1700s or early 1800s, people migrated out of New England to the southern state. It's not as much as Western migration into New York and to Ohio and other places, but there is a migration to the south. And again, you saw the lecture notes, I went over some of them for religious reasons, like Dorchester, South Carolina, settled by people who had come to Dorchester from Dorchester, Mass. Reverend John Cotton Jr. brought his flock down there, and others.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think we have just about enough time for a couple more questions
Sure.
here. So we'll squeeze those in. So then a question, what was the effect of the Acadian diaspora on New England? Were there any Acadian migrations to New England before the deportations?
You don't find as many settlement of Acadians coming into New England because of the tense problems with England and France early on. I'm not saying you don't have merchants and you don't have trading and whatnot and French fishing vessels coming in, but you don't find a populace coming down. In fact, for the most part, Acadians, you find the French neutrals, as they were called. These are people that would come into New England that were part of the Acadian settlement that were then living in New England homes and whatnot. They didn't go to New Orleans, they didn't go to Quebec or back to France. And these early Acadians, some of them did stay and are part of some of the earliest French Canadian families today.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And then last question here. Did British soldiers receive land grants in America after the French and Indian War?
British soldiers, as far as being colonial troops after the French and Indian War, were not getting the land that you would have got by the Revolution. Now, I assume when you mean British troops, you mean because we're all British at that point in time versus the King's Army that came over. Um, So in New England, you find that the settlement of giving land is from the 17th century wars. So the British colonial soldiers who fought in the King Philip's War, in the Phipps expedition, in the French and Indian War, not so much. That peak would change with American soldiers getting land after the Revolution, because again, we were land rich and cash poor as a continental government. And then, of course, those loyalist soldiers and British soldiers. In fact, I have ancestors that fought at Bunker Hill on both sides, including some of the regiments from England that came over to fight in Boston or be in Boston. One of my ancestors went up to New Brunswick and got a Crown land grant. So some British soldiers stayed in Canada after the war, but French and Indian not as much as, say, the Revolution.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, David,
My pleasure.
for that wonderful presentation today and for fielding those questions. And thank you to all of you for those fantastic questions you've submitted. We had a lot coming in, so I know unfortunately we weren't able to get to most of them. But if you do have more specific questions about your family history research, you want to write into our genealogists, you can access our free chat service at americanancestors.org/chat. It puts you in direct communication with a genealogist, and it's totally free and open to the public Monday through Saturday from 9 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And to access that service, you just go to americanancestors.org/chat. If you do have more kind of specific questions about your family history research, you might consider hiring our research services team. And we also offer consultations with our experts. You can book that through the link shown here on your screen or through the QR code there as well. And I also want to call out that David is one of our genealogists who gives a lot of these consultations. So you could even book one with him if you would like to. So thank you again for joining us today. You will have an opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback on today's webinar. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of our members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to help keep these programs free and to create more. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. Thank you all again, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.